Okay. Hi, everyone, and welcome again to another one of my GaudiMitspes22.com podcasts on Podbean and YouTube videos. Once again, great guest today. Great guest, Benjamin Peters. We've been trying to arrange this conversation for a few weeks, but through the internet gods were not smiling. It seems like over the past month, this has happened to me a couple of times now where I've had to cancel, but we're finally here. Benjamin is very involved with the Catholic worker movement, and he came to my attention because of this great book that I read. Okay, I'm a complete technological luddite, so I'm going to try and hold this up here. Benjamin Peters, and it's called to be Saints: John Hugo, the Catholic Worker, and a Theology of Radical Christianity, with an appendix of Dorothy Day's retreat notes. Before we get into that, though, Benjamin Ben Peters is, in fact, he's now a professor of religious studies at the University of St. Joseph, which is in West Hartford, Connecticut. There's a lot of St. Josephs out there. This one is in West Hartford, Connecticut. It's run by the Sisters of Mercy. He also has got his PhD under the tutelage of my very dear friend, Dr. William Portier at the University of Dayton. Bill, if you're listening, a big shout out to you. Great guy. And got your MDiv. Oh, you just told me where you got your MDiv, and now I forgot. Oh, Notre Dame. Yes, and then you got involved with Michael Baxter and the Catholic Worker House there in South Bend. Anyone who's familiar with the Catholic Worker movement is probably aware of Mike Baxter, one of its leading intellectuals today, former Holy Cross priest, now married, living in Denver. Mike, if you're listening, I do want to do a podcast with you too someday soon. But anyways, I want to talk about, we're going to branch out. We can talk about Dorothy Day. We can talk about anything you want. And if you're anything like me, you probably don't even remember three-fourths of what you wrote in this book. And haven't reread it in years. So if you say to me, "Oh, I don't really remember that," that's fine. But for those who don't know, okay, there was a rather controversial in some ways series of retreats, spiritual retreats, run by a priest from Pittsburgh called Father John Hugo, and they became known as the Father Hugo retreats. Dorothy Day really loved those retreats and the spirituality contained within them. And she highly recommends to her Catholic workers that they attend these retreats. And some Catholic workers did not like the retreats and kind of resisted a bit. And so they became, and then Father Hugo himself came under kind of suspicion that his retreats were a little too ascetical, a little too rigorous, maybe a bit Jansenist or something. I don't think any of that's true, but that's sort of the backdrop here as to why it was somewhat controversial. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Ben, and say, okay, just generically introduce this topic to us of the Father Hugo retreats and Dorothy Day's relationship with them, if you don't mind.
Sure. So I think, well, first, thanks for having me on, and thanks for plugging the book. The book did come out, I think, in 2016, though, so it has been a while, and so I may need you to remind me what exactly that
Yeah,
book
yeah.
is.
I just recently read it last year. I read it, so now it's a year behind me too. But still, I have
Good, good.
lots of notes in here and stuff. So go ahead.
But yeah, so I think the way the story goes, I think Dorothy had, her kind of story. She had converted to Catholicism, um, and the way she tells it, anyways, in the Long Loneliness, is she was, looking for something more, right? And had been looking at retreats. I think Maisie Ward of Sheen and Ward Publishing House was a good friend of hers, and she was the one who first brought to Dorothy's attention these retreats that were going on up in Quebec by a French Canadian Jesuit named Lacouture, and Dorothy at first read Ward's notes on the retreats and didn't think they really said much to her and kind of dismissed it. But then it was through a Josephite priest named Pacifique Roy, another French Canadian who was working in the United States and kind of came into the Catholic worker circles and was hanging out in New York. And he started talking more and more about these retreats. And Dorothy, I think, got attracted to that, and then he was the one who said, well, if you really want to know how this is done, you gotta find this guy John Hugo. Hugo was a priest from Pittsburgh, the Archdiocese of Pittsburgh, who had also kind of stumbled upon the Lacouture retreats when he was looking just to do his annual priestly retreat, and really kind of fell for this. And I think one of the reasons that that everybody seemed attracted to these retreats, which were largely based on the Ignatian exercises, and really the retreat itself is kind of encapsulates kind of, well, I guess the most popular version encapsulates just the first week of the Ignatian retreats.
Right.
There were sort of further versions that fewer and fewer people kind of took, but I think one of the things I think that people were attracted to was it really called people to take the call to holiness seriously, right? And I think for a lot of people, especially lay people at the time, that was not something that they encountered when they went on retreats, or kind of, we and I kind of get in this in the book. I don't want to get too lost in the weeds, but the kind of two-tiered notion of the Christian life, that there was sort of this supernatural calling, and there were the councils of perfection and these things, and but that was for monks, and that was for nuns, and that was for people who were called to that sort of what as like the supernatural life. Where for lay people especially, but even for more secular clergy, right, that wasn't something, because they had to deal with the day to day, they had to pay bills, and they had to take care of their kids, and so there was a kind of I think what a lot of people saw sort of a two-tiered notion of the Christian life. And I think one of the things that they found in these retreats, and I think what Hugo in particular did, because when Lacouture was giving the retreats, it was mainly to priests. But one of the, I think, the genius things about Hugo and was to sort of translate that, and to translate the demands of the Ignatian retreat to lay people, to say that we don't have a two-tiered notion of the Christian life, right? That all people are called to this idea of holiness. And I think there was something there that really struck Dorothy, and she kind of called it the bread for the strong. That this really demanded something, and I think you're right. Not everybody appreciated this. I mean, it was a silent retreat. She kept notes, which I was able. Marquette was nice enough, where all the Dorothy Day archives was nice enough to let me publish her notes. But so there was no talking. It was very simple, and I think in some way that kind of gave her the sort of theological juice that I think she was looking for since she had become Catholic, and so then she kind of runs with this for the next few years. Yeah. And then there's kind of Hugo gets into some trouble in various ways with the bishop, and what people think he's doing, and I think why they think
yeah.
And he has theories on why that happens too, that we go into. But yeah, so things have, but now what sort of happens is other priests then pick it up as well. So Hugo's bishop sends him away. So he's off at a rural parish, and he can no longer offer the retreats, especially to the Catholic worker. But then other priests kind of pick it up, and there are these retreat priests that Dorothy talks about. And up until the end of her life, you can find her talking about this. My theory is that the whole long loneliness, like if you read from Union Station to Rome, or the House of Hospitality, where she's sort of telling her life story, those were written prior to her encounter with the retreat. But if you read The Long Loneliness, probably her most famous book, her autobiography, you see her really changing the way she understands her journey. And I think she changes it in light of the theology that she gets out of the retreat, right? This idea that the supernatural life, that the life of holiness, that the Christian life is more than simply not being sinful. And I think that's the kind of theological nugget that I always got out of the retreat. Instead of a kind of a two-tiered, again, kind of metaphysical view of, where there's sin and there's grace, and sort of the job of the Christian is not to sin. That kind of, what the retreat says, well, that's sort of a very minimalist notion of the Christian life, that Christians are called to be much more than simply not sinful people, right? And so what Hugo introduces, and I think he gets this from Ignatius, is a kind of almost a three-tier notion where you've got sin, you've got nature, and you've got grace or the supernatural. And sometimes in life, and we have to discern this, Christians are called to move beyond not just sin, but also some aspects of kind of our natural desires or our natural attachments. What
Yeah.
Ignatius, the famous Agere Contra, kind of moving beyond or
Yes.
going against our natural inclinations. And I think for Dorothy, that sort of that idea that it's more than simply not being a bad person. I think that's at the heart, and so that means maybe giving up some things that aren't necessarily sinful, but maybe aren't helping us in our relationship with God. That's where Hugo gets into, I think, the controversy that you talked about, where people are saying, well, why are you telling people that they can't smoke, or why are you telling people that maybe they shouldn't drink alcohol? It doesn't mean that alcohol and smoking is bad. He's just saying these become these attachments that then we have, that then
Right.
become obstacles in our relationship with God. People heard that though, and I think, to be fair, a lot of people went to the retreats and then came back and said, this is what we talked about. And some of their pastors might have heard that and said, that sounds a little more than maybe.
Pastors who smoked and drank. Right.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I I always think of the scene in the movie version of Doubt. I don't know if you ever saw that movie with Meryl Streep, but
No.
there's this great scene where the nuns are all sitting in the convent, and they have this very dark, like one bowl of soup or something, and it's very dim. And then they switch to the rectory, and there's steak and there's wine and there's smoking. And I think, like, that's what Hugo was kind of, and I think it was those guys that said, whoa, 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 you like, we can enjoy life. And certainly, I think to a certain point he would say that, but I think his point was, just because we're giving something up doesn't mean it's sinful. And I think that's the kind of and so that gets translated, though, kind of in Dorothy's mind and Hugo's mind, into more than just smoking and drinking. Hugo was one of the few priests during World War II who came out in support of conscientious objectors to the war. He was against the draft. He and Paul Hanley Furphy and one or two other priests were really the only Catholic priests in the United States who kind of publicly opposed the U.S. participation in the war. And I think this, again, was kind of out of that same. It wasn't that the war wasn't just, it's just that the war wasn't this higher path, this sort of thing that was going to bring us closer to
Yeah.
God.
And I think that was Dorothy's. I mean, it cost a lot of. I mean, the Catholic worker movement was growing until World War II. And then Dorothy came out famously against Catholic participation in the war. And then the subscriptions to the Catholic worker paper and so on just plummeted. And she received a great deal of criticism. But I think people have to remember that the pacifism of Dorothy, and then from what you're telling me, it sounds as well of Father Hugo, is not simply sort of an opposition to this war because it's unjust. It's taking a higher vision of, at some point the church needs to follow a path of perfection that shows humanity the way to peace, and not simply endless constant war making between nations, that there is a higher path that we should be pursuing. Now, of course, that gets very complicated. All right. uh, Perhaps charity demands we defend the weak, and so on and so forth. I'm not a doctrinaire. I'm not a doctrinaire pacifist myself. What I'm trying to let people see, though, is that the vision of Dorothy and Father Hugo is not as simplistically reduced as people think that it is.
Yeah, and I think this idea, I always ask my students, like, if your best friend came to you and said, I met this great guy and I want to get married, and you were to say, well, why? And she said, well, he doesn't cheat on me and he doesn't lie, and you'd say, well, that's great. I'm glad that your future husband doesn't cheat on you and doesn't lie. But don't you want something more than that? And I think that's the kind of
Yeah.
that sense of, isn't there something greater that we're called to as Christians, this sort of call to holiness, this call to perfection, that I think they were pointing to, that moves us beyond simply, like, take war. I mean, so many of the debates, especially around, in the mid 20th century, were, is this a just war or not? And so if it's a just war, Catholics had an obligation, people were saying, to participate in it. Not
Participate.
just could they, but that they almost, it was a moral duty that if it was a just war, you had to participate in it. And so when you then get Dorothy and Hugo and these other people saying, well, maybe it is a just war, and so maybe participating in it is not a sin, but that doesn't necessarily mean that Christians should participate in it, right?
That's
and,
right.
And
That's right.
yeah, and I think that gets translated in different ways. I think now, though, looking 80 years on, I think that's much closer to where things are as we think about these things now than certainly they were back in.
And we can't think of these things anachronistically. I mean, even if, for example, certain elements of the American government and Western governments probably knew what the Nazis were doing, like in the death camps and so on, the average person in the street, like a Dorothy Day or a Father Hugo, was probably completely unaware of that kind of horrible humanitarian atrocity that was taking place. And through their eyes, remember, we have to look at it through the lens of World War I and so forth. To their eyes, it seemed like here we are engaged yet again in another one of these endless wars between European nation states that are ostensibly Christian and for largely nationalistic, idealistic purposes. Yeah. It just seems like, and then the war ends, and okay, now we have a Cold War with the Soviet Union. We're in Korea, then we're in Vietnam, and then blah blah blah, and then it's Iran, and then it's Iraq. Now it's China's the big enemy. And so all of a sudden you begin to realize, you take a step back and you say, well, maybe Dorothy and Father Hugo were onto something. Okay.
Well, I mean, and just having, just having that kind of idea, like, does participating in this war, will this bring me closer to God? I mean, if that's our ultimate calling, right? In that kind of Augustinian, is that, will this, and I think that's what that, I mean, now they Hugo especially could bring that down to the minutia of life of, will this second cup of coffee, and I think people, that's where people kind of said, well, is this getting too much, where it's pushing people to be, he talked about, like, you can see all these books in my office, like, well, maybe, do you really need all those books? Should I really, is that, are these weighing me down in my are these becoming obstacles? Because now I need a lock on my door, and now I need to protect my books, and now I get mad if somebody takes my book and marks it up, and I'm those things. Yeah. But I think just having that very basic, which again, I think if you look at the Ignatian retreats, I mean, so much of what Ignatius is trying to get the Jesuits to think about is, does this bring me closer to God or not? How do I discern the discerning of spirits? And yeah, I mean, can we honestly say that participating in a war, even a just war, can bring, and it maybe people can, but I think asking that question is usually not the question that's asked. Well, is the war just, or is it not just?
I think the World War II was a just war, even if it wasn't always carried forward justly. And I also think, as in all wars, there is a certain kind of charity born of heroism that a poor drafted foot soldier in the trenches, in the foxholes, does have to. I mean, you found great moral courage, great spiritual courage and heroism quite often in soldiers. And what that often leads to, a kind of romanticization and lionization, valorization of warfare. Like, you get all these chivalrous images of the grand warrior out dying for his country and his family and so on. And there's a certain truth in that war can bring out those charitable impulses. But the fact is, on the ground, what's the phrase? War is hell. PTSD afterwards and so on, which wasn't even known about during the time of World War I and World War II. The fact is, for the overwhelming majority of soldiers who participated in combat, war is a searing, soul-destroying activity.
Yeah.
that involves you killing other human beings, that can only diminish your soul, no matter how just, I can imagine if someone broke into my home and was trying to kill my wife and I shot him and killed him to keep him from doing that, I would consider that to be a just action, but I would also be torn asunder in my soul that I had killed another human being and taken their life, no matter how. So I think, yeah, that the higher calling of the Christian is this realization that life is embedded in a much grander supernatural vocation for all of us. But
Yeah,
anyway,
I mean,
I'm kind of groping for words here, but go ahead.
no, and I think this doesn't have to just be with war too. And I think this is where Dorothy. I mean, you think of, I remember teaching a class once, and just asking, are there jobs that Christians should not participate, even if they're
Yeah,
legal? So we can probably think of a lot of
yeah,
occupations that are legal occupations, and maybe occupations that someone could say, well, those aren't sinful. It's not sinful per se. You could have good people who are in this. I always think of like Tony Soprano. Like can you have a Christian in the mob? Could you have a good? Is it possible? And I guess we could have a mental exercise and say, yeah, you could probably think of a guy whose family, this is a family business. He wants to keep it going. He doesn't kill anybody. Maybe he knows people
right.
that do, but
Yeah.
we could say, yeah, but that's just, that's probably not a place that Christians should be. Christians should not be working in the mafia or like the drug trade or
Well,
something.
and I wrote a blog post one time there was this whole debate during the past election on Eucharistic coherence, right? Whether or not communion should be denied to President Biden or that candidate Biden because he's pro-abortion and so on. I don't really, fine, whatever bishops decide. Abortion is a horrible sin, and I'm not here to defend it. But what I pointed out in my blog post called Eucharistic Incoherence is that every sexual sin is considered grave matter, and I've had a conversation with Bill Porty about this. And yet, let's take a young Catholic man, say 25 years old, who works for the military, who sits in a nuclear missile silo, in a Minuteman silo, someplace in, say, Missouri, and he's been trained to turn his key, okay, along with the other dude in the silo with him, if they ever get the message to do so. And he's perfectly willing to do that. And they go through various drills in which they do that with, in a mock drill. That that young soldier is told by our church that that's fine. You're defending your nation, and there's a higher good that you're involved with here. I would say this: I think he's actually engaged in something gravely immoral. Even if he never turns that key, he has the intention of turning that key to incinerate tens of millions of people in a moment's notice. And yet, that's not considered sinful. If that same young man goes home and succumbs to sort of masturbatory temptations, he's now committed a mortal sin and has to go to confession. But sitting in that missile silo, that's not a mortal sin. That's I think what Dorothy and Father Hugo and these guys are pointing at the military industrial, that my goodness, what has happened to us that we don't blink twice at something like that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, and well, and that we still think, and it's funny. This sort of brings. I just finished a book manuscript recently. It's under review now, but on Gordon Zahn, who was kind of also in this circle.
But I don't mean to interrupt you, but the point that I was trying to make was there are some professions, as you said, that Catholics should not participate in, even if our church says they're good. And I would say sitting in a nuclear missile silo is one of those professions. But anyway, no, go ahead.
And I was going to get to that. I think you could take this out of the military complex too, and just sort of say, are there, if you're working for a private equity fund that's taking over business, shutting down whole neighborhoods, is that something that, yes, we could maybe in some way think, oh yes, you could still live a life of holiness working for a private equity, but like the guy in the silo, so because what I was going to say, what Gordon Zahn is kind of writes about is, yeah, like the way our moral theology in Catholicism says is, well, he still has the option he has to still make the decision, am I turning the key or not? You know, he has to give the presumption of justice and everything, but still we want to say he's got a moral agency. But that seems, what Zahn says is that ignores what you just said, all the training. He's been trained, never question this. When the light comes on, turn the key. And I always think of that. I remember that movie War Games.
War Games, yeah.
You know, and
turn your key, sir. And the other guy said, I'm not going to, unless I get confirmation, I'm not blowing up.
Yeah, we're not going to destroy the world until we have no, there's no calling anybody. You have to just, you know, and so I think, you know, so if we take this out of just the war and peace thing, which I think, you know, is one of that Hugo and Dorothy certainly focused a lot on, but I think we could expand this. You know, are there other occupations? Are there other industries who have the similar kind of training that would make it very difficult? You know, so maybe no one's going to put a gun to my head, but I'm going to lose my retirement if I don't go along with what the you know, or I'm going to get fired and I have a mortgage, and you know, and these are other ways that, you know, so are there places that you know, maybe they are just, and maybe they are not sinful. Maybe private equity is not sinful per se, but should Christians be participating? I mean, I think that's, again, this all kind of goes back to having those kinds of very serious discerning of spirits kind of conversation. Is this going to bring me closer to God, or is this going to take me farther away?
I think that's an important point, because even beyond whatever, say you have a particular job at a particular company and you're concerned with some of its entanglements with various other companies that are doing nefarious things. They produce things via sweatshops in South Vietnam and Thailand and places like that, or Vietnam now, I should say, showing my age, South Vietnam. But beyond that, you can ask yourself, you know, is this job bringing me closer to God in a much more proximate way? Do I want to spend the rest of my life working 8 to 5 inside a little cubicle, surrounded by 800 other cubicles, okay, in this anonymous, soul-numbing environment of corporate America? Yes, I'm making money. I'm supporting my family. There's nothing.
To the church. Yeah,
I go to church. There's nothing inherently immoral about what I'm doing, but is what I'm doing bringing me closer to God?
Yeah. And so I'd say, in essence, that's what the retreat. And I think what I loved about Hugo is he brought that out of sort of the clerical sphere and brought it into lay people and said, this is a demand for you. That then, of course, you know, at Vatican II, the kind of universal call to holiness is something that's lifted up. I think they were pointing towards that, and there was a lot, as you know, there was a lot going on in Catholic theology in the 40s and the 50s, you know, swirling around with these kind of nature grace questions. But
and I also want to I would quickly add, you know, there's a certain moral perfection and moral heroism involved in doing a job that you hate simply because it does put food on your family's table. Right. I mean, I don't want to be bourgeois and elitist Mr. Professor here saying, oh, everybody should, you know, have the luxury of a leisured life. I mean, there were coal miners and factory workers who absolutely loathed and hated what they did, but they did it because they had family obligations. They had mouths to feed. And so I don't mean to disparage that. What I'm saying, though, is along what you're saying is, I mean, if you have options, if you have real choices, and you're sitting here in a job that's killing your soul, and you have a real choice, then why stay there? Okay. Yeah. And Father Hugo was trying to get people to see, well, maybe you should not do that job. Okay.
Yeah. Well, or and again, or just the kind of things you have, you know, what do you prize in your life? You know, what are the things? Are there things that are, you know, he always had, there was a line I remember encountering in one of the retreats from John of the Cross about kind of our attachments to things, and it could be the slightest little attachment, but he had some analogy of a bird. It only takes a very small string tied to the leg of a bird to prevent the bird from soaring, right? And so they're looking at attachments in this way.
That's a great analogy. Yeah.
Yeah. So it isn't just the kind of middle class bourgeois kind of folks that can have these attachments, and I think, but I think all this to say, then sometimes that can get translated in a very what people would call Jansenist or perfectionist, which was being used in a more derogatory way, as and I
Yeah.
think Hugo drove some people crazy, for that very reason. I remember talking to someone at St. Vincent's in Latrobe, because that's where Hugo had gone to the seminary. And I said, I was telling him about Hugo. It was a Benedictine, and he said, well, let me go into the infirmary and just ask if anybody remembers who this guy was. So there were a bunch of older Benedictines, some of whom hadn't kind of woken up in a while, and he said he was kind of wandering around saying, does anybody remember John Hugo? And this one guy who hadn't sat up and shot bolt up in his bed and said, Hugo, and he like went into this whole thing about he drove me crazy because he'd get the seminarians being so like, no, we're only going to sleep on the floor and things like that. So,
Yeah. Well, maybe he was a bit rigorous, and
rigorous.
so
That
you
was the
know,
word.
yeah, maybe he was a bit rigorous, but that doesn't necessarily undermine the overall validity of his approach or his spirituality or what he was trying to say. And that would be my point. We've all gone on retreats. I've gone on retreats, and I was a seminarian once back in the day, and I would go on retreats, and some of them were Ignatian retreats. And the retreat, yeah, sometimes the retreat master, I thought, well, that guy's a bit, boy, that's draconian. Whew, that's pretty scorched earth. Wow. Okay. But I was still and I thought, well, I'm not going to do that. But I was still inspired by the guy. I was still like, he's onto something. He's kind of kooky, but I tell you what, he's really onto something important here. And I'm going to listen to what he has to say. And I think that is what Dorothy saw in Father Hugo as well. Like, okay, I may not completely, and Dorothy struggled with smoking, and I may not completely agree with every single ascetical piece of advice that this priest is giving me, but he's onto something. He's got an insight into what the universal call to holiness. This is the thing, and this is the question I want to bring to two things. Number one, and if you don't know the answer to these questions, feel free to say I don't know the answer, because one of them is historic. One of them is historic. Well, they're both kind of historical. Number one, how common was it, say before the Second Vatican Council, during the time of, say the 30s through the 50s, whatever? How common was it for Catholic lay people to go on retreats at all? And second, if it was fairly common, if it did happen, what was the nature of those retreats? Were they mostly, well, here are some nice rosary prayers, devotional prayers to help you in your fulfilling of your duties as mother and father, and we're going to give you Eucharist, some confession times and an examination of conscience, that kind of thing? I mean, please go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I think, and I'm certainly not an expert on it. I think there's a great book by Joe Kenichi on kind of the history of the retreat movement. But there was, I think, starting in the early 20th century, there was I forgot which pope had an encyclical that really encouraged lay people to make retreats, and there was something that came to be called the retreat movement more broadly inside of Hugo, and this sort of predates Dorothy's encounter with Hugo. And this is where I think you see the huge retreat houses that are now sadly closing down all over the United States. But that's where they kind of came out of this impetus that lay people should be making retreats, and parishes brought lay people all year round. This was something that it was almost seen as maybe not an obligation, but I think everybody did it. Everybody went on a retreat once a year, and so yeah, so there was this big push to get lay people making retreats. Now, what did those retreats look like? That's kind of I guess, up for debate somewhat. I think how Hugo would paint the picture is, yeah, it was more about, having a good time, relaxing, taking a break from your kids. Maybe you'd say some prayers, maybe you'd go to mass and go to confession, but it was really more of a vacation that was supposed to energize you. Maybe you heard some speakers that kind of fired you up a little bit, but then you were supposed to kind of use that to go back to your life and kind of live it in a little bit of a better way and be more but nothing as what he would think, I think, as radical as what he thought, like kind of what we're talking about here. Like, is my life bringing me closer to God? And if it's not, I need to drop this stuff away. And so I think there was this big wave, there was this big push, but I think he was always a bit dismissive, which probably did not bring him many fans with the other
Not
clergy.
many at all. Well, it says, in the subtext, the subtitle of your book here, Called to Be Saints, and, John Hugo, the Catholic worker, and a theology of radical Christianity. In this sense, I think Hugo's vision is very similar to Dorothy Day's. So it makes perfect sense why she was gravitating towards him. Because what Dorothy's insight was, Peter Morin's insight, and apparently Father Hugo and some others, was that unless Catholics become more deeply enmeshed, lay Catholics, average Catholics, unless they become more radically enmeshed in a Christian faith that lives out the evangelical counsels in a universal, they're going to fall away from the faith. I think there was a prophetic, prescient understanding that modernity represents a kind of toxic environment for the faith, no matter how much the church had accommodated itself, according to Dorothy and others, to bourgeois modernity and capitalism and consumerism, the cult of well-being, as Berdayev calls it, and Dorothy kind of liked Berdayev to an extent, that all of this militates against living faith. So you're either going to dive deep into the faith or you're going to leave it. And is that not what we kind of saw after the council, right? As the church to this day in the West continues to hemorrhage Catholics, so that the only ones that are going to be left are the ones who are taking the whole damn thing somewhat seriously. Yeah. And so Dorothy and Father Hugo are saying, yeah, and what does that mean? What does that look like? How should your life be different from that of bourgeois modernity and consumer? Not that any of the consumer goods you're buying is sinful, but you need to look at the bigger picture and say, what is all of that, all the accoutrement of your life doing to you as a Christian?
Yeah. And again, that kind of simple question of, is this bringing you closer to God? If that's our ultimate goal here, is this stuff, and whether it's your job or whether it's your books or whether it's titles, is this bringing you closer to God or not? And I think what they were also kind of pushing back is that we were living at a time where people were telling lay priests and bishops were telling lay people, don't worry about that. That's not, you need to be worrying about, paying the bills and, being a good person, don't sin. And I think that more, again, that get back to that kind of two-tiered versus what I'm calling a more three-tiered theology.
Yeah. And that kind of what I call sometimes even pietistical devotional Christianity that says you don't need to aspire to holiness. You don't need to aspire to sanctity according to living out the evangelical counsels, living out the Sermon on the Mount, as Dorothy would say, and Peter. No. As long as you're living out the commandments and you're saying your prayers, okay, and going to mass, you're cool. You're in. All right. So don't sweat it. Don't worry about it. And this is the life of it's two-tiered. And it really did set up this two different classes of Catholics, the vast majority of lay people who are simply to be content with living the basic commandments. And then, as what Robert Barron calls them, the spiritual athletes of the church, all right? The spiritual athletes, the celibates, the monks, the priests, the nuns. Those are the only ones that can be truly holy. And therefore, to put the Father Hugo retreats into context, that's what he was trying to bash away at.
It is, but and I think too, and this is something that I struggle with in my own life. But if I think this is what Dorothy Day, why she was attracted to like the little way of Therese Lisieux, because I think sometimes we think, and this is also why I think she never wanted to be called a saint, because I think she sees these things as that spiritual athlete. Well, that's not something I can do because I got kids. And I got to pay the bills and I have to worry about these things. And so there's almost a kind of giving up. Well, I guess I'll just stick with not being a jerk, or I guess I'll just stick with not being a bad person, because I can't be Francis Xavier kind of marching through and converting the, and I think where Hugo, but I think Dorothy and Therese, I think what they were kind of pointing to is you can do this holiness can be found. It doesn't have to be, you have to give everything up and you have to sell everything and you have to go live in the Bowery, that it
Yeah.
can be and I think somewhere in my intro, I talk about, I'm writing this book while we're raising four little children, and getting up at 2 o'clock and this was a Bill Portier line somewhere. Getting up at 2 o'clock in the morning with a sick kid has to count for something in terms of holiness.
Oh yeah.
This is bringing you. So it's looking at your whole. And I think again, Ignatius was great with this, and I think looking at this holiness in terms of how do you translate that into a life of a family, because it really hadn't been at that point. I always wonder, why aren't there more married saints? Like, why don't we have more married saints, especially with children, that we can look to? That's one thing the church needs. We need more married
Well,
saints.
that means we need to alter the way we make saints, because the reason why there are more priest and nun saints is because they had religious orders behind them that had monetary motives pushing. Not that these people aren't really saints. The point, though, is you needed an organization behind you to push your cause in Rome. Well, where's the organization that's pushing the cause of married lay people in Rome?
But if we're going to take this seriously, we have to start looking at ways that my very mundane day-to-day life here, that there's opportunities for holiness. This whole, and this is where the more, I think I talked about this a little bit, the more kind of mystical side of the Jesuit tradition is emphasizing this idea of kind of the duty of the present moment, that there's always an opportunity in your day-to-day life to find some way to live this holiness out. And so
go ahead.
So the more that, because I think someone might hear us talking like this and saying, all right, you two, well, like, you look pretty comfortable and you have heat, and well, so have you kind of, where's the holiness there? And I think that's something that, we should never become comfortable and say, well, I guess I'm holy now, I'm doing it.
Well, actually, I barely have heat. We were able to afford this farmhouse because it was actually a condemned house that no bank would touch, and we had to put a little bit of money in it. But we heat the house. There's no central heat. We heat the house with a wood stove in our kitchen, and in fact, I just fed the fire before I came up here. No, okay, so I have a wood stove and I have wood, and all that costs money, but there's nothing romantic or quaint about it. But anyway, I'm not here to toot my horn. Point is that none of this, and you mentioned Teresa of Lisieux in the small way, the little way. None of what Father Hugo or Dorothy Day are recommending in terms of a radical form of Christianity necessarily involves what I would call the imitatio Dorothy Day. You don't have to go and, like you said, live in the Bowery. It can be something as simple as this: taking the way you currently live, okay, and if you judge that it's a little too opulent, there's too much largesse in your life, and you want to divest a bit, fine, go ahead. But overall, and I love your example of waking up with the sick kid at night. The fact is, we've not done a very good job as a church of showing married people how, in point of fact, their life as spouse and parent of children is always already a sanctifying moment, and allowing them, therefore, not so much to radically alter their life away from what it is, but to see the entirety of their life in a different light, in a different context, to see every little thing that they do as precisely a movement towards God and sanctity. In and through I had a sister that died of a heart defect. She lived for 5 years. And I remember I have this vivid memory of my mother sitting up all night with her sometimes as she was vomiting and, sick from the medicines. And then the next morning, my mom would have to still dutifully get her other 4 kids ready for school and out the door and do the other chores, and then go back to her sick daughter. And, that's sanctity. And yet, has the church done a great job of letting people know that is sanctity?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and saying that holiness, that the opportunities for holiness, and I think this is get to Dorothy, and I think to Therese, and that the opportunities to holiness are always present. We have to just find them, right? We have to be looking for them, and that's the discernment part that I think they get from Ignatius, especially. But
Oh yeah, and
Yeah,
something as simple too as if you are in terms of not just parenthood, but you have a job in the world and it's a fairly secular job doing secular things and it doesn't seem to have any immediate religious impact. The fact of the matter, though, is to remind yourself, as C.S. Lewis says, you never encounter a mere mortal, that everybody you encounter in your day to day life is an immortal. And therefore, to conduct yourself at work in such a way that you begin to actually care about the people that you work for. You are willing to do things for them. You are willing to extend yourself for them, to show them kindness above and beyond the call of duty, to show them an interest in their lives, and so on. Of these things, too, holiness is made. And all too often, I don't think we see just the normal run of day to day, work a day. Here's what I do at my job. Events as moments of sanctity as well. And yeah, that's the small way of Therese, right? Doing dishes, cleaning the floor, doing just her duty and her job. Those are moments of sanctity.
well, and also those are that's I think where, to kind of get back to kind of a thinking of this theologically, where grace and where the supernatural can sort of work within nature. That it's not something that, well, I go on a retreat or I go to mass or I do this and that's where the supernatural, and then I come back to the kind of mundane, profane, but that bringing that grace into the job. So yes,
Yes,
taking care of a sick child, working, being patient with a coworker, or doing something that maybe no one even noticed. I always love the spiritual work of mercy of bearing wrongs patiently. That you're not even telling people that you're doing it. You're
that's right. Just bear them patiently.
just
You
put it
know,
up.
and anybody who's ever worked, before I was a professor, I worked for a direct mail marketing company in Lincoln, Nebraska, a cubicle job, 8 to 5. Did that for several years before heading back to grad school and so on. But anyway, point is that we talk about the parish community, and the parish community is very, very, very important. Obviously, that's where you are rubbing shoulders with those who are explicitly Christians, just like you, and engaging in liturgical worship. And it's a hub of outreach that goes out from there. But the fact is also that for most people who have jobs in the workaday world, the vast, vast, vast majority of their time is spent with their fellow human beings in that community. And it comprises, therefore, a real, as anybody who's ever had a job working in a place like knows, it's a real community, right? I mean, and not just at, once a year at Christmas parties and things like that. Sometimes you create some of the deepest bonds of friendship of your entire. My father was a fireman, and some of the deepest bonds of friendship he ever developed in his entire life were with his fellow firemen. Some of them Jewish, some of them, non-practicing, some of them Catholics, but that was his community as well. And that's a specifically lay vocation, right? That's a specifically lay form of holiness, to find community and therefore moments of sanctity in that community as well.
Well, and it also kind of gets us back to the point of, you know, does it matter then what your job is?
Mm-hmm.
If this is the community that, you're going to spend the majority of your waking hours with these people doing
Bingo.
thing. Now, again, as you noted, not everybody has the opportunity to make choices like this, but to think, is this group of people, is this job with these group of people, is this helping me do this, or is it working against that? And so I think seeing, like, recognizing the importance of that,
Yeah.
and of that, of the influence that those other people are going to have on you too.
Well, yeah, I just saw a video recently of a priest who was recounting in an interview with his vocation story, and it was a delayed vocation. And he worked for many years in the business world. Talk about exactly that he realized that, I can't remember what the job was, some job in the corporate world, and he realized that everybody that surrounded him was obsessed with making money, and that the pressure to make money was enormous, and there weren't any friendships being developed. It was just competition. And then he further realized that in order to advance in that company, and it was a kind of company where you either advanced or you got out, you had to engage in the cocktail party circuit and the party circuit and the going on these opulent trips circuit. And he just suddenly realized, I cannot continue in this job and be a Christian. I can't. And so he left and then pursued seminary.
Well, and again, not that you couldn't theoretically, you could, and I'm sure you
Right.
could give examples, but as I tell my students, it's a lot harder. It would
Yeah.
be a lot harder than if you were doing something else. Now that's
Well,
something else that doesn't happen
as Peter Morin
necessarily,
said, our goal is to make it easier for people to be good,
no. Yeah.
to build
And
a
so,
society where it's easier for people to be good.
no, and this is why parents always worry about who their kids' friends are, because that, you want your kids to be with friends that are helping them be good, helping them
Yeah.
to be people,
And
not
you and I probably both know people, and I know lots, who were in fairly lucrative jobs and decided to quit and move to something less lucrative precisely because the job was toxic. Toxic to their faith, toxic to their soul, toxic to their psychology and their emotional well-being. And so off they went. I mean, you see people do this all the time, and not even necessarily for specifically Christian reasons. It's like, wow, that job was killing me. All right. And so, yeah, I mean, so
no, though
go ahead.
I wonder if someone said, I quit this job not because it was killing me, but because it was bad for my soul. If people would look at them funnier than they would, oh yeah, the job
Yeah.
was crazy out.
Yeah.
I mean, there's some reasons that we kind of say, well, that's a logical. But if someone said it wasn't bringing me closer to God, yeah, it was a great job, but it wasn't bringing me. So I gave up my $1 million
Yeah.
a year career. People might scratch their heads more. Even Catholics, I dare say, might scratch their heads. Why would you give up a great,
Oh, I know. Having lived near poverty most of my adult life, it's like, someone says, well, money can't buy you happiness. My father said many times, he goes, money doesn't buy happiness, but it can take a naturally happy person and make them damned ecstatic. Because he never had, as a fireman, he never had a whole lot of money either. And, had 5 kids. And so, and yeah, so, but once again, we're not saying that money is bad, but, but perhaps there comes a time when you need to give a lot of it up precisely for the sake of advancing in the spiritual life. I once knew a woman very wealthy, and we were in this group together. I don't want to say what, but she was a very nice woman. I loved her very much. She's a great lady. But one day we got into this conversation, and she goes, I'm really reading a lot about St. Francis of Assisi these days, and I very much now want to pattern my life more after Francis. I'm so inspired by Francis of Assisi. So I said to her, I said, so what does this mean? Are you going to be like giving a lot of your money away? She goes, oh, and she goes, no. It simply means I'm going to be more detached from these things. I'm just going to cultivate a spirit of detachment. And I said to her, no, that would be more the spirituality of one of the sainted kings of France, perhaps. But the spirituality of St. Francis is specifically you give all that crap away. Because it's an obstacle. You can say I'm detached from this, but in reality, if you're unwilling to give it up, are you really detached from it?
Well, and even I spent prior to grad school, I lived in Kenya for a year, and I found a book. Somebody gave me a book on a biography of Charles de Foucauld, who's now Saint Charles de Foucauld, whose feast day we just celebrated on the 1st. But so much, and he's the one he was a Trappist. He was living in North Africa, gets killed. And then his spiritual writings are discovered later on, and then the little brothers and sisters of Jesus kind of. But so much of his focus was not just kind of material poverty, but this idea of humility. Like it was all about, and this is what I love about the Little Brothers of Jesus, who Jacques Maritain, by the way, died as a member of the Little Brothers of Jesus, which I always think is a fascinating.
That's great.
After Raisa died, he joined, but that they look to, and these are oftentimes very educated people who join this community, but they look to not just take jobs that maybe aren't high corporate jobs, but also are they at the lower end of the prestige scale? So if you're going to work at a college, don't be a professor, be the person who cleans the rooms.
Yeah.
And that there's a sense of almost, and I think that fits in with kind of what we're talking about here, that there's sort of a, because I can say, well, I don't have a lot, but but I have a certain prestige of what I do, or people look at me, oh well, you must be smart, or you have all, and even that, someone like De Foucault is going to say that can get in the way here, and
Oh, so
kind of
true.
thinking, and so thinking about this really opens up the possibilities for, again, lay people especially, to kind of see opportunities for holiness in so many different ways, even in how you think about yourself and how you want other people to think about you. Like,
And to reach a point in your life where holiness and its pursuit is no longer simply another optional lifestyle choice that I'm making, because that's to return to like that two-tiered view of things. I'm okay just living down here in the life of commandments, and if I add holiness on top of that, well, that's cherry on the ice cream, as Bill Portier would say. That's Jesus sprinkles on the ice cream. Okay,
he
but
was using
to
that
reach,
back then. He used it.
oh yeah, he's been using it for years. Great line. But to reach a point where you begin to realize, for me, I'm not going to generalize for everybody else. For me, I'm either going to pursue holiness or I'm screwed. Okay, I'm at a crisis point. And like in my own life, I don't want to generalize and say every professor teaching theology should do what I did, but just for me, I reached a stage in the professorate where I was very comfortable. I was making good money. We had a nice house. We were having parties. I was going to Rome every year, taking other trips, going to fine restaurants and all this, all the while teaching courses on the Catholic Worker Movement and Dorothy Day and Peter Moore and Catholic social justice, very abstractly. And both my wife has a PhD in theology too. My wife and I reached independently at the same time, as well as our friend Father John Gribowich, this realization. For me personally, I either have to give all that up, not because it's bad in and of itself, but because for me, it's an obstacle. As you just said, this is an obstacle to me. I am too attached to all of this, and it is my idol. It is that which stands not as a sacramental icon of God through which God's grace comes to me. It stands as an iconostasis beyond which I cannot go. And I needed to get rid of it. And now here I am then on this Catholic worker farm, poorly farming, very poorly farming. Catholic worker homestead, I should call it, 11 acres for those listening. It's not really a farm, it's more like a homestead. But you get my point. All right. So I'm not going to condemn like other professors like you who stay in the ranks, and my former colleague Rodney Hauser, who's still in the ranks. For me, it was a barrier. And so I had to get rid of it.
Yeah. No, these are questions my wife and I wrestle with all the time. I think because we
Yeah.
as we
Oh, and I still take trips and I still go out to restaurants, and they still raise all those same questions. Like, what am I doing? This money could have been spent for, XYZ.
Well, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think, I think that ongoing, again,
keeps us on our toes.
That ongoing discernment, even on a daily basis, of, is this something, is this an opportunity? Is this, whether it's the person asking me for help at the side of the road, or a colleague, or I'm being offered an opportunity to do something at work, or, do I do this with my kids or not? These are all that little way, these opportunities
right.
to say, is this something that is going to bring me closer to God, or is it not? And I think that takes, that's where, to get back to Barron's idea of athletes, that takes stamina, because you can't just kind of lay back and go, well, I'm here now and I'm not going to worry about it.
That's why St. Paul called it a race. I've run the good race. We are pilgrim people, to use a much cliched term. We're on a journey. We are on a journey. We live in messianic time, as Giorgio Agamben says, messianic time, the time of the in-between. And therefore, it's an ongoing and constant assessment of where we are on that path. I'm constantly still re-interrogating myself about, well, what does it mean to be a Catholic worker? What does it mean to have a Catholic worker homestead? Am I allowed to take this trip to Rome to do XYZ? Or should I have spent that money on the farm, and so on? Yeah, it's a constant re-interrogation.
Just think of that kind of Ignatian examine at the end of the night. What happened to my day today? Were there
Yeah.
opportunities in my day today that I possibly let grace go by, or I didn't use those and I think it is that but that again, that takes work. That takes like to kind of get back to what we were saying. That takes good teammates. To be a spiritual athlete, it helps. It helps to have good teammates. It helps to have a spouse that is also
Oh
wrestling.
yeah, my wife. I could not. My last book, Confession of a Catholic Worker, by Ignatius Press. Uh, I dedicated to my wife, where I say, if I ever make it to heaven, it'll be because of her. I
No,
dedicated to my long-suffering wife, who, if I ever make it to heaven, she will have been the reason why.
yeah,
And that's so true.
and I don't think, again, the kind of like the whole question about lay people as saints. I don't think we talk about marriage like that enough as a pathway to holy, or having children as a pathway to holiness. That these are opportunities. I
Oh
remember
yeah. Well, let
reading
me
something
tell you,
once.
being married to me has to be a pathway to holiness
It
because
has to count for
it's a
something.
living crucifixion, I assure you. I'm not the easiest person to live with. I might come across in these podcasts as quite avuncular and whatnot, but I can be hell on wheels.
No, so
But anyway,
I didn't mention this, but before I went to the MDiv, I was in a Franciscan with the conventional Franciscans, and I made it through 9 months of the novitiate year. And I always laugh that marriage is like an ongoing novitiate year. You have somebody who's always asking you, "Why did you do that?" And why did
yeah,
you like that? That's the best explanation of what a novitiate's like. It's like being married, but you're instead of a year, it's your
yeah.
whole life. You have somebody.
All right. Yeah. Well, we've been at this for a little over an hour, and maybe we should start wrapping this up a bit. I don't. I mean, I see some people have podcasts that go on for like 2 hours to it. I like to keep mine to an hour, hour and 10 minutes. The amount of time that sometimes people have on their commute or their morning walk or whatever, so they can listen to it. So, do you have any final thoughts? I really thank you for coming on. This has been a great conversation. Finally, that we hooked up. Do you have any final thoughts you want to leave with the listeners?
Uh, no, I think uh, thanks for having me on, and thanks for this discussion. I haven't thought about a lot of this in a while, which maybe it explains why these thoughts were popping in my head as we were going along. But no, I think seeing Dorothy Day, I think maybe just to kind of end with her, that looking at her as this model of somebody who was more than simply not a bad person, and
Yeah,
I
she
think
was a nice lady.
yeah. No, and I think seeing her as her story as a model of this more three-tiered idea that what the Christian life, and I think she was very aware of that she didn't think her life was an extraordinary thing. This was an ordinary,
Yeah,
that this is something all, and again, to get back to the "don't call me a saints" line that people love to throw at with Dorothy, to sort of see that this is something that's possible for all people, I think.
yeah.
Um, and and that we should all pool together money and start promoting the cause of married people to be saints. We should have some kind of a
Yes. Well,
some
yeah. I
kind of
mean,
fund that
maybe
does
whole Episcopal conferences can start
yeah.
a little pool of money for promoting married
I think
saints in
well
our ranks, or just lay saints. I mean, this is a problem. So why we don't have more lay saints in general? It's because
yeah.
they don't have an organization like a diocese or a religious order to push their cause. A saintly layperson dies, and it's at their funeral. People say, "Well, what a saintly guy he was,"
Yeah.
and then that's the end of it. You
Well,
know?
and then we wonder where the church isn't speaking to people, and I think showing models that your
Yeah.
life can be a saintly life, as opposed to, well, all I see are
It's somewhat changed. You know, you had Carla Lakutis and people like this that are now saints, and hopefully Dorothy Day will be a saint someday officially, but we'll see.
on
But anyway,
Jaeger here. I have to
oh
put
yeah,
a
Jaeger's.
I have
Yeah,
to
oh
put a
yeah,
comment
oh
on
yeah,
Jaeger.
absolutely. We need more lay saints, and I certainly probably will not be in their ranks, but we'll we'll see. We'll see. Hey, thanks for coming on, Ben. Maybe we'll have you on again for a
Thank
follow
you.
up if you're open to it. And but anyway, we're done here for today. Thanks everybody for listening today, and thanks for joining in. And hey, everybody. Have a Merry Christmas. I probably will not be posting this till after Christmas, but I hope you all had a great Christmas in retrospect. So thanks, everyone. Bye bye now.